All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Can you all hear me? Yes. All right. So thank you again for joining today's webinar, where we'll be talking about unleashing Africa's economic opportunities. We're super lucky to have a number of speakers with us today who bring really unparalleled perspective, I would say, from different areas around the continent and different perspectives. So let me begin by just introducing our speakers today, starting with Dr. Oby Ezekwesili, who is a globally renowned economic and human capital policy expert. Dr. Oby is actively involved in advising reform-minded leaders of countries all across the world on vision and strategies to achieve sustained and inclusive, equitable economic growth across Africa. Dr. Oby is a former vice president.
Sorry, Mommy was in a meeting. What's wrong?
So we need to mute someone, it seems. So Dr. Oby is a former vice president at the World Bank and the former Nigerian Minister of Education. She sits on many, many boards across the world, including Nexford University's board of directors. We're very lucky to have her with us today. Next is Omid Kassiri, who is responsible for Kenya and Ethiopia offices at McKinsey. He is a McKinsey partner, and the report that McKinsey recently published sort of instigated this webinar, so we're very lucky to have him with us today. Omid is heavily focused on the private and public sector clients across a variety of different sectors, focused on topics including growth, investment, and digital analytics across Africa. And finally, Laila Macharia, who was raised in Kenya, Namibia, and Somalia. Dr. Laila is the director of the Aspen Institute, or Aspen Initiative rather, in Africa. She's a serial entrepreneur, an investor, and a senior advisor to Nexford. She is also the chair and the co-founder of the Africa Digital Media Institute. She served on a number of boards, including Absa Bank in Kenya and Centum, both of which are listed on the Nairobi Stock Exchange. Thank you all for joining us today. To begin with, I'm going to hand it over to Omid, who is going to walk us through McKinsey's most recent report or some of the key findings that they have. This session will take approximately 10 minutes. And then from there on, we're going to move to a panel discussion, which we'd like to keep as interactive as possible. So anyone that has any questions, please feel free to pose those questions in the Q&A. We'll try to get to them throughout the coming hour, hour and a half or so. Omid, I'll hand over to you from here.
Thank you very much. Morning, afternoon, wherever people are, to everyone. I send you greetings from Kinshasa, DRC. I hope my network connection holds up for the course of the discussion. I'm going to very briefly share a few of the key findings from the report that we published earlier this year, titled Reimagining Economic Growth in Africa, Turning Diversity into Opportunity. Some of you may have read our previous work on Lions on the Move, which from its title was a very positive perspective on the continent. Our objective was to refresh that work, and we thought of calling it Lions on the Move, but realized that the most recent findings were not necessarily as positive as we would have liked. And so this is just a very honest perspective that we will share with you today. Great. So I'll go through it fairly quickly. Apologies for not spending a lot of time on some of these. But really, the top line message here is that in the decade before this last one, we had a pretty decent GDP growth of 5% over 10 years across the continent. This shrunk quite considerably over the most recent 10 years, down to 3%. But as you can see, what has remained consistent is the growth in employment. What has not been consistent is the growth in productivity. And so the real focus of this report is on productivity as a pretty significant driver of the future economic outlook on the continent. Between 1990 and 2000, it accounted for 0.3%, it grew to 2.2, and then back down to 0.8. It's a very busy slide. I'll actually just take you to the very bottom row. In comparison to India and China, what you see here is that Africa has continued to maintain pretty significant population growth of around 2.5, 2.6%. But compared to India, which has had a much slower one, yet when you look at our GDP growth is smaller. So it really contrasts the impact of low productivity as a driver of GDP growth. Now, we all know, but I think it's important to just be reminded that as much as we talk about Africa, it is not one country, and that there are quite different dynamics between these. The way this chart was drawn was on the x-axis, we had GDP growth between 2000 and 2010, and on the y-axis between 2010 and 2019. So those countries that you see on the top right are countries that grew above, let's say, 4% over the last 20 years. Those on the bottom right grew faster between 20 and 10 years ago, but slower in the last 10 years. And similarly, you can read the ones on the left. And so what really stands out at you is that the bigger economies depicted by the size of the bubble, you're not seeing many of those in the top right. And that has been pulling down the overall growth of the economy. What we are seeing is a fundamental shift away from agriculture and towards services. So while agriculture, you can see the population, the percentage of employment in ag has continued to decrease, and the percentage of employment in services has continued to grow. And the same holds true in terms of its value add to the economy. This is good. Many young people don't necessarily want to be in agriculture. Many want to be in services. Services is where you see real growth. You are starting to see that shift. However, from a productivity perspective, almost across every sector, we are seeing on the continent productivity be much lower than any other part of the world. Again, coming back to the theme of the importance of productivity. Yet, as a continent, we all know this, but it's really interesting to see it so starkly shown. The population, the working age population of the continent is going to surpass everywhere else, and not just surpass it, but from a trend perspective, while everywhere else starts to come down, Africa's working age population continues to grow. Some call it a dividend, to some it's a time bomb. It entirely depends on what we do with it and the opportunities that are created for it. From a trade perspective, I'll just focus on the left-hand side. What you see in the light blue across each of these different sectors is how much of our imports are from other African countries. In most parts of the world, in most continents, you're seeing about 30% of produce coming from within the continent. In Africa, it's often less than 10%. So a big need, imperative to significantly increase intra-Africa trade. I'll actually have us look on the right-hand side here. And what you see is Africa is importing very little in the way of resources from the rest of the world. What we are importing is a lot of manufactured goods. Again, demonstrating the imperative and the opportunity to locally manufacture. By 2040, the continent will have 31 cities with more than 5 million people, up from 12 million today. That's 2.5 times in 15 years. This is huge and has real significant implications. However, one thing that is really interesting is in most parts of the world, if you look on the right, you can see that in most countries, the entire population is not focused on just one city, and that there's a decent spread of population across multiple cities in a country. Whereas in Africa, it's quite stark. What you see are the big cities, and even then, the second largest city is often a very distant second. And what this, again, this speaks to the massive rate of urbanization, but it's all happening often within the capital of these countries. And very little development in infrastructure and jobs is going into the number 2 cities, which means that you're having massive pressure on the infrastructure of the big cities, but also you are not creating regional nodes in a country for economic activity. Consumption growth has slowed. Again, population growth has kept up. But you can see between 2000 and 2010, 5.8% growth to 3.3% CAGR between 2010 and 2019. Again, the big delta has been a reduction in consumption spend growth. Again, coming back to the topic on productivity. Across the continent, we have about 350 odd billion-dollar companies, but these are not well spread across the continent. South Africa accounts for the bulk of it, followed closely by Egypt, Nigeria, Morocco, which together account for about 60 to 70% of these billion-dollar companies. Why do we care about large companies? Because they are, first of all, an indicator of the ability of an economy to sustain growth of companies, but also these larger companies are able to spend the dollars on R&D and build skills and talent for their economies and ecosystem as a whole. Unfortunately, what we've seen over the last 6 or 7 years is that the number of these large companies across the continent actually came down as opposed to in other parts of the world where it grew. So that was a very quick snapshot. As I mentioned earlier, I'm in DRC. It's a particularly difficult country, but I walk the streets and it is in great need, but unbelievable potential. You see it. The need creates the potential for growth, for innovation, and for making a difference. Some ideas on what we do. Number one, focus on productivity from a policy perspective. I believe we've been focused on growth for a long time. There are levers that you need to pull to drive productivity. Building talent on the continent is key. We see opportunities in driving up domestic manufacturing and complementing that with intra-Africa trade, which the Africa Free Trade Agreement is trying to bring to life. There is a lot of money in the world on the net zero transition, and actually Kenya is hosting the Africa Climate Summit in September, and I do believe we will see some very big announcements being made, not just for Kenya, but across the continent. It could become, carbon credits could become one of our biggest exports. People think that Africa is a very low emitter of carbon. I think the number that's trending is 3%. The actual number is 10 of global emissions is from Africa, equivalent to Europe, but not out of industrial chimneys, but as a result of land use and land degradation.
Thank you, Omid. We're going to come back to, thank you so much for the presentation and those follow-up comments, Omid. We're going to come back to this concept of carbon emissions and what that means for people. But let me set the stage for the discussion a little bit for folks who have joined the call. The objective from our perspective, Nexford University, hosts these webinars to really add value to current and prospective learners and society at large, entrepreneurs and employers across the continent. And we try to make it as practical as possible so people attending these webinars can leave with an idea or two on what are the skills that I need to gain in order to capture some of these future opportunities, or what are the current economic opportunities that I need to be aware of as a business? What are the risks? So these are sort of the questions we try to answer. And that's why these webinars are such a big part of what we do at Nexford University. So I'd like to just start with asking a high-level question, and maybe Dr. Oby, you can take this one. You know, Africa, geographically, the content is huge. It's as large as China, the US, Europe, and India combined. Unfortunately, the world maps we use nowadays don't portray it as such, but that's the reality. It is ethnically diverse. So to begin with, you know, how practical is it for one to combine the continent when talking about economic challenges and opportunities? Does it make sense, or should it really be sort of unbundled more than we tend to do?
Thank you, Fadl, and thank you to our presenter of the McKinsey report. Thank you, and to welcome to all our panelists, my co-panelists, and the audience. I think that the key to the question that you asked is why is it that we care about scale in the world of economic policy? We care about scale in the world of economic policy because small does not get you far. And you know, too many fragmented countries on our continent means that you have to put triple the effort that you need to put when you are operating at scale into trying to do things across each of the countries. And so one of the best things that's come out of the continent in recent times is the AfCFTA, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and the area that has emerged out of the ratification of that agreement by majority of the countries on the continent. Now, if that is understood, and we do know that Europe was similarly inclined with, you know, countries not in Europe until the idea of a Eurozone emerged, and you have the EU as not just a political arrangement, but an economic arrangement. It's a big difference to join up countries in the kind of way that economies of scale become possible. Because everything that we're discussing about investment, everything we're discussing about talent, you know, being able to produce these things at scale present an opportunity. And that's what Africa needs to be doing at this time. When you compare regional trade in Africa at less than 15%, with Europe at more than 70%, with Asia at more than 60%, with the Latin American countries with at about 45 or even inching toward 50 now. You can see that we're way below what is possible. And if we're going to solve the productivity problem, then we do need to have these kinds of critical joining up of the interesting opportunities and factors, endowment, but doing it in a way that we understand that productivity is not possible without removing the barriers that, you know, lead to the kind of growth that does not structurally transform economies. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Oby. Laila, I'm going to go to you. Laila, one of your many qualities is the ability to distill and simplify concepts to people. So for those on the call today talking about, okay, trade across Africa is much lower compared to other continents. You know, we need to increase that trade. We need to reduce barriers. So what would you say are, you know, some of the actions that individuals on this call can take, whether be it business leaders or entrepreneurs or future, you know, business leaders? You know, what's the action here?
It's still a large question, Fadl, but I try. So I just really want to pick up from what Dr. Oby said. It's true that Africa's a large continent, but we're still a very small proportion of world trade. I think it used to be something like 2%. I don't know if we've come up above that. And so as a representation, we really do need to catch up. We're behind and we have a lot of work to do. So this idea of really looking at productivity and moving forward is really important. And as Dr. Oby says, this idea of scale is what allows, if you think of Kenya or East Africa, these are still, you know, 180 million people or something like that, which is not enough to make a really viable market. So as a business person, you really want to have a total addressable market that is substantial so that it gives your business room to grow. And you'll see that many companies at an early stage start to do this. So as an individual, as a business person, it's really about seeing your market as much broader than your country, starting to understand the needs and demands of your customers across borders, and then starting to break down those barriers as much as you can yourself. The challenge, and I think what the Act is trying to do, is really to make sure there's infrastructure, whether it's digital infrastructure or physical transport infrastructure, or those things we call non-tariff barriers, where it's not just about the taxes when you cross borders, but it's really about, what is the flight routing if I want to get to Gabon, for example? Do I have to go through France? Do I have to do 3 connections? So there's a lot of work that can be done around that by our authorities. And we as individuals can do a very big part of the work of the advocacy in making sure that those policies change. But at the end of the day, these barriers between us are self-inflicted largely. And if we can start to team up and be very serious about it and put it on a time scale, we can start as individuals, as businesses, breaking down these barriers.
Thank you, Laila. So connected to that, breaking down the barriers is going to require, we spoke about, productivity, and we're going to touch on that again. Education is obviously core. So today, less than 9% of Africans actually have a college degree compared to say 30 or 35% in the US. What solutions exist or are needed to really leapfrog this development and significantly increase access across the continent without compromising on quality? So it's open really to all panelists.
I think I can take a stab at this. I think a big part of it, of course, is creating education that individuals want to invest in. And what do I mean by that? If you're able to see that investing in a degree or in training of any kind actually will lead to a better job or better economic outcomes for yourself, you're more likely to see it as an investment and go into it. As far as making sure, and linked to that is making sure that then the product, which is the educational products, if you want to call them that, are very market relevant. So are we designing curricula together with employers? Are we preparing students across the gamut of not just domain skills? Am I a good marketer? Am I a good business person? But also those career readiness skills and soft skills that make you a very effective career person once you're in the job. I think doing those different things will start to raise not just the enrollment, but the value of the education that we offer. I think that the last part is access, and I think Nexford has a lot to say about this, right? It's exactly our philosophy, which is really, how do you make sure that online education is available so that people are not having to travel a very long period of time, it's affordable, and they're able to make that investment, get in and out in a way that they control, so that then they can see their career start to move forward.
Thank you, Laila. Omid, anything to add to that from your perspective?
No, it's been really well covered, actually.
All right. Let's move to.
I would just add that the power of example is amazing on the continent. What the continent really wants to see is that the value of years in schooling do really come home. Okay, so we're now having parents who sort of look at education with cynicism. And where is that coming from? It's coming from the fact that children who have graduated from university system are back home, depending on the same families that perhaps borrowed money to give them education in order to just sustain living while we're looking for jobs. And the average time waiting for a job is just too high for many on the continent. Every time that annually, I think the last data that I checked says something of about 9 to 10 million African children enter the labor market, but only about 10% of them would get what is called decent job, according to the definition of ILO. And so it is important that the continent should really expand opportunities. And that's where we get back again to the work of McKinsey on this topic. We do need structural transformation of the economies to diversify into, not just low productivity services this because the shift in agriculture is actually not shifting into manufacturing. Manufacturing is still way below at less than 12, 15%. And then the services that's getting most of the transition from the farmlands is actually very low productivity services. People hawking things on the street or eking out a living through all kinds of little businesses. So clearly, the demand side issues as well as the supply side issues would be important. Train for employability, do the reforms that are necessary in terms of right sound policies, the right institutions and regulatory systems, as well as invest in the critical infrastructure and human development that we need in order for businesses to show up more into Africa or to grow within Africa.
Definitely. So Dr. Oby, let me ask you, I mean, I'm sure many people on this call today are listening and questioning, okay, well, in the absence of these opportunities, should we be looking to leave the continent? I already saw a bunch of comments on that earlier. Is education a path to leaving the continent? Why should we get educated if there aren't local opportunities? So what would you say to folks maybe thinking about the viability of either starting businesses in the absence of these opportunities or thinking about remote jobs in particular? Are remote jobs potentially a real solution to the employment challenges on the continent? When you think about the US and the UK are going to be aging populations over the coming decades. Africa is going to have the opposite demographics. How much of the solution are remote jobs really going to be?
I think that they would be part of the solution, but not the it's a necessary part of the solution, but not a sufficient part of it. This economy still does need to have a massive manufacturing base, but you don't get to manufacturing base if you don't have the kinds of skills and critical transfer of technology that is necessary. And so that's where the whole role of governance and the right kinds of policies, building the right kinds of frameworks that would be attractive for the emergence of these new layers of opportunities coming. Remote jobs are a huge part of it because, technology is one of Africa's three game changers that I often talk about. The fact that technology is offering the African child global level opportunities in the sense that, Nexford, for example, is an American-based online university. The only difference is that they're not sitting in the classroom that is built by brick and mortar, right? But in terms of the content of knowledge that they are getting, anyone who is sitting in a similar university in Washington, D.C. or in Berlin, as the case is getting about the same thing. And so it means that they are at parity in terms of global knowledge that they are accessing now because of what technology has done for the continent. And you think is one of those three game changers, and you have to ask me, what are the other two great game changers? And they are the young people themselves, and that showed up in that presentation by McKinsey, and the women of the continent. These are sub-optimized human resources of the continent. Imagine where we can unleash, where we can unlock the kind of productivity that is held back because they are not participating in the development process. So I would say, yes, remote work is a major part of it. We already have that showing up here, by the way. I'm sure you know. Some of the students who are graduating from Nexford are reporting that they are getting jobs, becoming part of project teams abroad. It is the way of the 21st century. And 21st century is Africa's century to claim. But to do that, there are prior actions that are necessary. And sadly, a lot of the prior actions that where we're dropping the ball fall on the table of governance and governments. But what we should be doing as people who are interested in conversations like this is really to give hope to the young ones that the world will find them at the level of appreciated skills that they keep giving to themselves. And that's why schooling outside of the formal traditional systems that they used to know is one that they must, just rearrange their minds to embrace it. I still see quite a number of children who sort of think, oh, it's, going to an online university is inferior to going to a traditional university. And when I look at them and I see that the offerings that you have are so massive. A lot of the traditional institutions are having difficulty adjusting to the new life that we're in this disruptive technologies era. And the advantage that connecting to global universities that may be online gives to you is enormous. And increasingly, I think employers are beginning to just simply look at what a person can do for me. And a lot of what a person can do for me that companies are asking are pretty much digital tasks. There's so much of digital tasks that people are looking for. And it's important that we should encourage the young to have an innovative mind, right? You've got to have a mind that is ready to embrace the new and to know that there is a whole user journey experience that people are recording where, you can empirically establish that there is value to getting high quality education that you would ordinarily not get, especially also because look at the rate of enrollment for tertiary education in Nigeria or in the rest of Africa. It's still way below the global average. So right. We are oscillating between 10 to 12%. The rest of the world is somewhere between 25 to 30%, sometimes 35%. There is such a huge gap, and that gap is being filled by these kinds of opportunities that we're discussing today.
100%. Fantastic insight, Dr. Oby. So the takeaway there, I think, is basically we're saying online education can level the playing field in many ways, right? Regardless of your physical location, you're now able to educate yourself if you're in Nigeria, in South Africa, in Indonesia, and access the same quality of someone else sitting in Los Angeles, and therefore be able to access these remote opportunities as they continue to grow. But let me move to you, Omid, to follow up on this point. So Dr. Oby touched a lot on digital transformation and the need for essentially, folks to have these digital skills. There's a big question around Africa's young population, usually referred to as the continent's biggest asset, right? Is the continent actually better suited to leapfrog adoption of technology and leverage, AI and other technology to drive productivity? So give us some hope here for folks on the call who feel like, there aren't any jobs. Some continents are struggling with transformation, right? They have these legacy businesses, very difficult to transform, and they don't have the people to transform them. Does Africa have an advantage over these markets because they're already young people and therefore much more digitally native?
You asked me an open question, but you said I should give hope. So do you want the truth or do you want the spin?
You can give us both.
The truth.
Look, we speak of Africa, and I recognize a lot of the people on this call are the more privileged on the continent. But I just want to make a few things clear. So in Israel, a child starts to learn about AI, adapted for children, at the age of 8. At the age of 8, the school system starts to teach them basic elements of AI. In Estonia, every 13-year-old child gets their own laptop and programming from the school that teaches them how to work that. On the continent, I know 30-year-olds who've never worked on a laptop before. So I'm just going to start with some of the negatives. That from a policy perspective, we just need to realize this is where the world is going. And what used to be as basic as math and reading is now the digital age. And if the education system is not responding to that, we are going to fall really far behind. Now, the people on this call will be different, but I was responding at an African perspective. 2, so much of what we learn is not about your education, but it is about the environment of exposure that you have. When you are in an environment where everyone is talking digital, everyone is, you're immersed in it. You are learning without learning, without trying to learn. We don't have that here. We don't have the ecosystem across the continent that just completely instills us with this 24/7. So we're starting a little bit behind. However, this is where the hope is. We are starting behind, but we do have an enterprising young population. The world is looking to diversify away from Asia in its supply chain. We will not become in a rush the suppliers of semiconductors, but what we can become is the supplier of talent. But we have a disadvantage in it, as I described. So we are going to have to make huge efforts as individuals and as societies to overcome that slight disadvantage that we start from. Now, you spoke about one last thing, which was leapfrogging. I don't believe that most of the digital jobs that we're going to create in the next 5-10 years is going to be digital jobs for Africa. There will be some, but the majority, in my view, will be providing those jobs for the rest of the world. We are seeing models that do that. So leapfrogging doesn't become relevant in that sense, but our continent does need leapfrogging. I'm in DRC. There are no roads. There is barely any electricity. Telecoms is really poor. So if you think about the evolution of banking in the DRC, it is not going to follow the model of hundreds of branches and then agency banking. It is going to jump to digital banking. Even that has its challenges, but by necessity, we are going to leapfrog. And there are opportunities for the more enterprising amongst those on this call who want to go and fill those gaps.
You know, I want to piggyback on what you've just said, and also state clearly that we cannot assume that people will entrepreneurial themselves out of poverty, because that's not the kind of scale that is possible, and that's because of the many roadblocks to it. But one key thing that can unlock possibilities is really government paying deliberate attention to a critical issue you raised, which is early grade learning, just even the science of learning. Right, 9 out of every 10 African children are not achieving basic literacy and numeracy at a proficiency level as the rest of the world. Now that creates a problem because it means that foundational literacy and numeracy is in crisis. And so for most of those who we should worry about because of the inequality issues on the continent, we do need to make sure that public education is fixed and that foundational literacy and numeracy gets to be a priority for the continent. And then it prepares them for the world of work, the world of life, the world of entrepreneurship. That's one. The second thing is that the example you cited with DRC is a good example, but that's not the full story, right? Because we do know that part of the story of what digital transformation can do for the continent showed up in the M-Pesa. That's an innovation on the continent, right? Which is the fact that, the brick and mortar banking, getting banks to establish branches in all nooks and crannies of countries, that's no longer the model for the continent. The telephone is not just simply a telephone. A smartphone is a tool for financial services, for achieving, accessing financial services, for accessing a lot of other services that our own generation accessed differently. So in that, there is hope, as the situation may appear.
So thank you for that, Dr. Oby and Omid. I want to double down on one of these points Omid raised earlier about talent and outsourcing in particular, right? Whether we call it digital transformation or it's not transformation if there's nothing to transform, right? So to Dr. Oby's point, M-Pesa is a great example. M-Pesa didn't take customers that were at traditional banks. They took people who were unbanked, and all of a sudden they became banked on their phones. Let's talk about what are the top skills or the main barriers today for foreign employers to access talent on the continent. And Laila, maybe you can speak about this today as we speak, not to the future, not in 10 years, Today, as we speak, there are thousands of vacancies online today. There are thousands of vacancies, foreign employers, say in the US or the UK, are looking to fill, but are struggling to fill. And therefore, they are looking outside their countries. They've been historically hiring in India or in the Philippines for such talent. Why are they not hiring in Africa as much? And what needs to change for that to happen?
Thanks. I mean, lots of work has been done to try and understand this. Of course, we need to do a lot more. Because when we think about this, of course, we say there's all these vacancies in the West, aging populations, and all these young people in Africa. And this is what we call, at ADMI, Africa's gift, right? If we do the right things, we can deliver this population to solve the problems of the world. But the first barrier is really around the skills, because we need to be very, very deliberate about making sure that the services we're delivering are very relevant to the different economies we're talking about. The experience that we have had is that many of these clients, if you think of, a firm in the US that's looking for creative tech skills, maybe a game designer or an animator or something like that, they tend to have very large economies and are very super specialized. Whereas here, because the economy is smaller, we tend to train people in a more generalized way. So the ability to get the experience that you need to be really well qualified takes some time. And then because there's a shortage, you'll find that these people do get snapped up and there's still a gap. So the first thing is really skills. And as we said, the skills are domain. Are you a really good programmer? Are you a really good game designer or animator? Whatever it is that you're selling. The second one is really that cultural barrier. So are you able to remake yourself to be able to sell to your client? And it doesn't mean that you have to become somebody different, but many of us know that when you go into a professional context, you put on a cloak of professionalism. So you speak a certain way, you respond to your clients' needs, whether it's needs for time, even if there's a time difference. So the second is this bucket of kind of collaboration, communication skills because of that cultural gap. But the third one is really around infrastructure, because we still find that in some African countries, as you could see, the report really talks about, I call it a tale of two Africas, right? There's these who are really growing or accelerating, and then there's these who are either slowing down or were slow to begin with. So we have these two groups. You can chop and change differently, but that was basically the story. So you'll find that in some countries, we're doing better about making sure that there's high-speed internet, that people can access these jobs. So we really need to do better. And I agree with the other speakers that there's nothing more important really for us as policymakers, as business people, as leaders to be discussing than this. This increase in productivity with skills at the core of that, and infrastructure as a close second. And then the third thing is really perception, right? We really have seen in study that when you have people putting their skills online, sometimes there is some need for education of the market, because some people are very used to their, graphic designer coming from the Philippines, their programmer coming from in story around Africa and the talent that is here is another big task. And that one is usually not a task that an individual can take on, which takes us back to this policy discussion. How do we pull together to not just skill our people, but deliberately in parallel be telling the story that there's this big, trove of talent that's on the continent that can solve some of these talent crunches.
Thank you, Laila. I want to go to the audience. And I know we've talked about this, but we need to talk about it more given its significance. So we have a question here, which I'm going to answer. How do we bridge the productivity gap? It's a broad question, obviously. So let's maybe go around the speakers today. This specific person is asking, how do we bridge the productivity gap? How do we identify or acquire relevant skills to meet global tech needs? Who would like to give that a stab? And maybe let's leave aside governments for a second. So assuming governments are going to fix the problem, what do people do?
I can start. I think one is really around being very critical. Firstly, I'd like to say that this report is a blueprint for the continent, right? So everybody should read it. Everybody should understand what it says, because it really distills, even at the end, in 10 priorities about the areas where we need to do things to shift this problem and move Africa forward. I say this because if you delve into this, you'll see there's suggestions for agriculture. How do you increase agricultural productivity? There's suggestions for greening the economy, right? How do we start that tradition towards decarbonizing? It talks about how is it that you grow big companies. For somebody who's trying to plug in skills and understand where is it that I should invest to be able to be relevant, we've already said that cross-cutting digital skills are it's almost like a prerequisite before you can even play in the game. But understanding the direction that Africa will be going in and where the needs and gaps are is a first step in understanding where you as an individual can invest so that you're more relevant and serving a need that exists. So that's
can you recap on those, Laila? So agriculture, you talk, just maybe recap on those for people on the call. What are the top 3 or 4 industries?
Yeah, so in the report, it talks about the importance of agricultural transformation. So we've heard from Omid that overall we are transitioning towards services, which economies aspire to do. But a very large proportion of the population remains in agriculture. And of course, even if they didn't, we all need to eat. We need to feed all these 800 million new people coming online, right? But our agricultural productivity is still very low. Some of the things we can think about there are things about improving the supply chain. There's a Dalberg report that said this, between 30 to 50% of food is being wasted. This is in the food, inefficiencies in the supply chain are creating this loss. And almost, $1 billion is lost every year across the continent.
So supply chain is a cross-cutting.
So supply chain is one, and all the automation that goes along that. We can improve our cold chain. Part of that is also making sure that we're able to store this food and transport it. Of course, some of that comes because of transport inefficiencies. So that's one bucket of things we can do. And there's a lot in agriculture for those who are interested in that, where they can delve down for opportunity. Then there's regional integration. So logistics and trade. And the report makes this point that it's good we're moving towards trade, but it's mostly, as Dr. Oby said, this petty trade, right? So individuals, very fragmented, very informal. So how do you start moving towards those areas like finance, like tourism, that are higher value and will deliver a better return for you as a person who's investing? So that's another area where we can look at. And then in the green economy, and in that regional integration, there's also exporting. So there's doing the integration itself. So how are you building digital infrastructure or becoming, I don't know, a trucker or a road builder, whatever, that whole opportunity that will come as we start to integrate. But then this really has implications for things like exports, right? Because then you're able to start moving into other markets in a more deliberate way. And this can be trade, it can be trade in goods, but it can also be trade in services, right? So we see our creative industry, for example, really carry. So if you look at Nigeria or Tanzania and some of these areas, these countries, they're really selling cultural products in a very powerful way that's actually quite unprecedented. So there's a big opportunity in that regionalization area. So those are just 3. So one is agriculture, another is this area around the green economy. And we have to generate much more clean energy. There's a transition happening there, and you can plug into that. You can also start to create more environmentally sensitive products. We say about things like just, hairpiece, in Africa, there's this incredible amount of hair that somebody needs to come up with a way to recycle or to create an alternative for this, or the plastic. There's many, many opportunities there for you to do good, but also do really well. And then the third is around integration itself. But there's much, much more in this report, many sectors with very specific ways in which you can plug in and offer value that can also, advance you and your career, but also help the continent move ahead.
I agree with everything that Laila has said. And Laila, thank you so very much for, laying it out in the way that you've done. And of course, for the report that really dug deep into it and is very analytically strong in terms of the kinds of proposals that it makes. But, for purpose of this conversation, just simply looking at how is there an Africa exceptionalism? is an important question to ask. Is there an Africa exceptionalism that has consigned us to a fate of having the lowest productivity when compared with other regions of the world? I would say that there is actually no Africa exceptionalism. And so mindful of the fact that Fadl did say if we held governance constant and looked at other factors that are important for productivity, we do know that we can put them on our fingers and say that the kind of investment in plant and equipment that aids productivity is key and critical. So we do need to look at across the spectrum of even existing sectors and figure out how much of that we're seeing, how much of innovation are we seeing in sectors that currently even exist, and the opportunities that are held up in lack of innovation within those sectors. When you talked about the matter of the improvement in supply chain logistics, but how deliberate have we been as a continent in looking at the opportunities therein? The two anchor countries on our continent are not doing very well in understanding the power of the data that says that 1% growth in South Africa or in Nigeria could lead to a 0.5% growth for the rest of the continent. We do need the heavy lifters of the continent, the big economies of the continent, understanding the value of this regional integration, and therefrom getting a sense of how the whole supply chain logistics improving this across the spectrum of economic advantages would be helpful for the country. And then, of course, the matter of competition. We do need to be a continent that is comfortable with competition, because, competition leads us toward innovation and efficiency gains, right? And we sometimes lose this because we are sort of trying to be protective of what it is that we know at the moment, when in fact, what we don't yet know, by ensuring that we are open to new ideas, we're open to better ways of doing existing things, would also be helpful to boost our productivity. And then I think that one thing is in specific sector kind of issues, I would say that the financial sector is really waiting for more deepening. When you look at the narrow base of capital market on our continent, so it limits access to finance. We've got a whole gap between pension funds that we have amassed on our continent. We don't even leverage our reserves, our national reserves well in just broadening access to capital. So we do need to think of the financial sector and the kinds of reforms that are necessary there. Then we need to reduce regulatory barriers on firms. Just the bureaucracies can hold back productivity. We need to pay attention to that. And then, getting issues of infrastructure bottlenecks and those both at the domestic, rural level, and then at the regional level, the interface. When I was at the World Bank as VP, one of the areas that mattered to me was, power pools on the continent. So we had to have, regional power pools, because if you could pool the production of energy and understand how to distribute at the different times of needs, even though it's a thin base of existing megawatts of power, but it does make a lot of sense to do power pooling. And so those infrastructure bottlenecks that we can solve at scale, we should pay more attention to them. Yes, you don't want to hear about the government, Fadl. I'm surprised about that, because you know that it is a critical bottleneck to productivity. But the improving public spending on education, improving existing public spending. Let's not even talk yet about adding more to the percentage of the GDP of public spending that we use on education. We do need to improve the quality, the outcomes, the learning outcomes. If we don't improve the learning outcomes, we're just simply going to abandon too many children to failing school systems that then will not help them nor the economy.
100%. Thank you, Dr. Oby. We're going to go back to government in a second from a different angle. But before that, maybe let's just answer, because I'm seeing lots of sort of questions around online education in particular. And to Dr. Oby's point on deregulation as well as protectionism, essentially part of how we move forward is by deregulating and allowing the private sector to move forward and allowing more competition as well, and letting market supply and demand dictate who are the good quality providers from the poor quality providers. So we've seen some markets today, including Nigeria, launch some reforms recently to start accepting more online universities. So some of the questions we're asking here, and this is open to all panelists, multiple people are asking, how do employers today on the continent regard online degrees? What is the acceptability of an online degree versus a traditional university? These questions we honestly used to see, 4 years ago, quite often. We haven't been seeing them as much today, but what perspective would you bring, whether Omid from McKinsey's perspective, when you're looking at the graduate, are you looking, is this an online degree or not? And obviously, Laila, Dr. Oby, please chime in as well.
I think that's a question for Omid, right? So Omid, go ahead.
The world of education, Dr. Oby, is something you're familiar with. I feel you've thrown me under the bus with that one.
We're talking about it from an employer perspective, Omid. So it's really not from an employer perspective. Has the world moved beyond thinking online, offline? Is that history, or is it still a reality today?
I think the world is moving into the realm of going beyond the online, offline into experience.
Mm-hmm.
I actually don't care what your online, offline is. What I want to know is what can you do? And the world is looking for apprenticeship.
Yeah.
It almost doesn't matter what sector you're in.
Yeah.
If in agriculture, apprenticeship is what turns you into a real agronomist. If you're in the digital space, all the models that we have in Africa, Andela, they don't care online, offline. Actually, what the companies care about is what can you do? It's
the skills you have.
No, that was not the question, but I'm starting with the ultimate thing of what do employers care about? That you can do what you're meant to do. Your degree speaks something to it, but I think that's becoming somewhat less of the focus. And so for young folks, I'd say, yes, being thoughtful around online, offline accreditation is very important. What is even more important is the 5 years after that. What kind of skills and experiences are you learning? And are you working, something Dr. Oby said really resonates with me, that we won't entrepreneur our way out of poverty. And frankly, I also disagree with a lot of how the development world says, oh, entrepreneurship is the answer for Africa. For crying out loud, 80–90% of entrepreneurs fail. Why do we think that youngsters out of university are going to be more successful at it? So I really think finding opportunities, even as youngsters, where you are apprenticed by those who know more than you, even if you're an entrepreneur, is super, super critical.
Laila, anything? You're on mute. Did you want to add anything?
I'm just saying amen here on my own. It's just really, yeah. When we talk about a talent crunch, it's really around this idea that we as employers are really looking for talent and if we're going to grow. And I think people are becoming quite agnostic. And I think the focus is really what can you do for me? Right. How do we add value to each other? So that's absolutely right. It's not, I think we are moving beyond that to seeing what skills does this person have.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, as an entrepreneur myself, I need to push back, however, on our colleague Omid here. So I do think that entrepreneurship was going to have a huge role in creating job opportunities on the continent and creating value. I think where the distinction needs to happen is this notion that entrepreneurship means building a very high risk tech startup, which is where the failure rates are very high. But if you think about small and medium-sized enterprises which essentially are entrepreneurial in nature, at least in how they start, that is the real engine behind the world's largest economy today, the US, right? It's not, the Fortune 500. So they're the largest employers and they're what drives economic growth. So I think the takeaway, at least from my perspective here for folks, thinking about this entrepreneurial journey is definitely, it's not a black or white where I'm going to build a software startup that, or a SaaS startup that can be huge or nothing. There's a huge spectrum of small businesses that add real value that people should be thinking about building, and those will create real jobs, particularly in the service sector. So that's, I think, a completely, almost an untapped, area for growth across the continent.
Yeah, I think, Fadl, some of I think an additional nuance, we're just seeing a lot of people who are now saying that, I'll never be employed, or, I'll go straight into this. And I think the statistics show that even to become a successful employer, it really helps if you've actually worked, you understand corporate structures,
Sure.
you have a bit of experience. So it's really about that. It's just this idea that is in some quarters, almost like, everybody's going to become an employer. And then we're asking, who is it working for all these people? So it's about just being much more disciplined about the way also that you start an enterprise. Have you done your research? Is it really needed? Are you responding to a market need or just an idea? There's a whole discipline that I think that generally we ought to bring into the knowledge around what it is to start a business. And linked to that is this idea of apprenticeship. An older person or a person who is further along can be a good mentor to help you, avoid some of the mistakes. You don't have to do everything wrong that everybody else did, right? You can learn from different ways of apprenticeship and mentorship.
For sure. All right.
Fadl,
go ahead.
Yes. I think that what's key is to define the kind of expectation we have in terms of small businesses. What we know now is that more than 70% of Nigeria's GDP, for example, the labor, is accounted for through informal sector. Now, informal sector is low productivity. And so if we just simply keep the whole idea of entrepreneurship at that level, and we say that that's how, we're going to absorb our people, then we're just going to permanently stagnate the people as well as the economies. And that's why I try to be nuanced in terms of the way we talk about the entrepreneurship solution. We do need to have entrepreneurs. A lot of our young people in the world of technology, in the world of creative sector, they really are, entrepreneurs. The talent sector is showing a lot of prospect for entrepreneurship on our continent. However, we do need the big businesses. We do need I don't need to be even, saying much about that. The McKinsey report shows that clearly, that, having mega businesses on the continent is important. At the same time as, making sure that we have an environment that supports the young person who wants to, start up on an idea. The current situation is that we're not like Singapore, for example. Singapore, from the very beginning of schooling age, they already sort of map the user journey of an individual. And some individuals are just going to be cut out for preparing them. Like Laila was saying, the coaching starts immediately. The structured kind of apprenticeship starts immediately. The same thing with a place like Germany, so if that kind of a strategy is also a good strategy for building up an entrepreneurship base. But let's not simply say, when you graduate and you can't find something to do, you can't find any job, just start some business. Because that's like too frustrating for a lot of the children because they are not accompanied by any form of support, neither from government nor from the private sector. And that can be really a miserable journey to embark upon. But entrepreneurship, by all means, but let's not put all our eggs in the idea that that's what's going to lead to the kind of productivity that we are talking about. One of the things that interested me in the report is something that I have always been fascinated by, which is the role of cities in economic growth. and development. Cities are so important. Cities are economic corridors. And the more that you have, the cities that generate economic activities, the more that you see that you are expanding even more innovation is happening, more entrepreneurship is also happening. There are more opportunities being made available. So what is it that we need to do for us to not have more cities that come to global standard? All right, global standard, global level, because today there are remote work, so cities are competing for talent, right? So a lot of people just saying, I'm tired of what do they call that place in Silicon Valley, and I'm just going to go find a quality space in Massachusetts and live there. I'm going to migrate away from high cost accommodation and the whole pollution, maybe in places like Beijing or other societies like that, and say, I want to go to a rural enclave in a city that is also a city because it has all the functionalities that a city should supply, right? So investing in that, even for us as a continent, is critical. If we're going from 12 cities and we need to get to 35 cities, there are definitely steps on that journey, and we have to be ready to take those steps.
Thank you, Dr. Oby. Related to this point, I mean, we have a number of questions from the attendees asking, what's it going to take for, what's the impact that urbanization will have on real estate? So Mary's asking this question. Maybe Omid, you can take it. She's asking, in the report doesn't talk much about real estate industry as a driver for economic growth. What are the opportunities that may exist there?
Again, if I may just take a step back and talk about the benefits of cities. And Dr. Oby mentioned this. I think it actually lines on the move too. We spoke about cities quite extensively, and we saw that the productivity of individuals in cities was 2 to 3 times higher than productivity measured in terms of output of those people in rural areas. Now, that's not to say, therefore, everybody should move into cities. Maybe the question is, how do you get more city-like environments?
Yes.
Not just in the biggest capitals. Real estate, I mean, I don't know. It's an interesting question. I think real estate is so defined by very specific cities. Just because more rural people move into cities, that does not mean that real estate prices are impacted overall for a city up or down. Because typically what we do, which is very unjust, but is the reality, is we shove those people into slums and cordon it off. And those slums develop their own dynamics, whereas and that doesn't affect the rest of the city. I think real estate prices and development is affected by other factors. I do just want to say that real estate is a really big issue for agriculture. Often, if you think about it, and I was reflecting on this in Nairobi not long ago, cities are built in places where there's natural endowments, because those cities have been built based on where rivers were and where we grew things. And Nairobi is where coffee is prevalent. And as cities grow, we then replace those natural endowments with houses. And in doing so, unless there is really good planning, we are destroying, because the productive potential of a piece of land on which there is a house is 0. Whereas it produced something when you had coffee or tea or some other agricultural product there. So I do feel cities need to be really mindful of the effect of urbanization and land use on their productive potential for the future.
Okay, let me add. Thanks, Omid, because you did make very strong points on this. And just to add to it, we could look at the whole real estate conversation from the perspective of housing deficit on the continent, right? We do know
Yes.
that there's serious, significant housing deficit. In the case of Nigeria, I think it's anywhere between 14 to 16 million. In South Africa, it's something of about 3.7 million. Ghana is at about 1.7 million. These are all opportunities because we do know that economic growth also can be derived through construction, right? And that the construction activities track back to many other related sectors that could support the kind of growth that we are looking for. I think that the private sector role in the development of housing and the fact that we also see an interface of existence of access to housing for poverty reduction because of the fact that it amounts to an accumulation of assets by those who were originally outside of that kind of opportunity. It is definitely an aspect of the whole growth journey that we should pay attention to. And that this is part of what we're saying is that, taking into consideration the point you're making, would we continue to have the agriculture field or should we build houses for people? Well, the truth is, if you've been to places like Kibera in Nairobi, all right, the Kibera slum in Nairobi, you would know that doing something about housing is important. And it is what kind of innovations can we bring to that process? When you look at African type houses, the fact that it requires so much land is an issue, right? So there are innovations in terms of housing types and housing models. All of these go into the sector of real estate. And I would say that young people, if you've been able to achieve innovation in many other sectors, begin to think of how you achieve it also in terms of meeting, bridging the housing needs that we have on the continent.
Thank you, Dr. Oby. I want to take a few more questions as we have about 20 minutes left on the session. It wouldn't be a webinar in 2023 if people weren't asking about AI. So let's talk about, lots of people asking, what is the effect of AI on current and future jobs in the US, in Africa? Are a lot of these jobs going to get automated? What should people be thinking about, when it comes to agriculture? There's going to be a certain level of automation there. What's the panelist perspective on how AI will shape economies over the coming few years in Africa in particular?
I'll go. So my experience is that, at the firm level is that AI is already making a very big difference. It's raising productivity in the marketing department, in the finance department. There's much less data entry. There's many solutions that are already raising productivity. So I think it'll come to the heart of this question we're saying. If at the end of the day, productivity is doing more with less, then indeed this could be part of the solution. Again, here we don't say there's anything that's a silver bullet to anything else, but it really can help. And so we talked about in agriculture, one of the solutions might be automation and reducing loss, in the supply chain. AI can really help with that. And in addition to, so in many, many sectors, it will really help us start to do more with less. I think even the area of preparing people for AI brings another opportunity, right? So the education opportunities around that are also another area. So far, so good. True, and I don't think we should deny that if we say that data entry is being reduced, that doesn't mean that some data entry jobs, some of the ones that are, the lower end of the administrative chain might not be replaced. But I think the challenge, and again, this goes back to the strategy of individuals as they upskill. So really adopting a mindset that you're going to have learning agility, to always be relearning and to not resist that, right? To expect that this is the wave of the future can help you start moving up that chain so that you don't feel that AI is a threat to you, but more of a tool that you can use. So I think that's how to think about it. But the one solution is not to put your head in the sand, and the other one is not to panic, at least not yet.
Definitely no need to panic, because we see that what AI will do is it will take away a good number of jobs. Sometimes I've seen numbers of say 300 million and all kinds of millions are being suggested. But it also shows that it can create new types of jobs. And your own generation, the generation of the AI era, the generation that has redefined work, right? The future of work, and you find that the tasks that come out of what you call work today, your parents never even thought of those as jobs, but they are jobs. They are jobs that are creating opportunities, and so it's important that you should be, as Laila said, in an adaptive mode. Adaptation is a very important skill to have at a time like this. So embrace the world of AI, because even though it would remove some jobs in order to create the basis for the kind of productivity that it brings, it would also provide new opportunities. And that's why, I'm actually very happy for those of you who come to the Nexford University to take courses around AI, cybersecurity, and all the other forms of, blockchain technologies, and all the things, simulation science, and all of those things that we know are entirely redefining what our society would look like for the rest of the 21st century. You want to be solving complex problems, right? If you were going to be solving complex problems, we don't need you using your calculator to do that anymore. So the AI is definitely your friend in many ways, and you should embrace the fact that this era cannot be complete without it.
Right.
If I may just share a bit of a story for people, because I know you hear us saying, don't fear it. Exactly what AI will do, I don't know. Net. I thoroughly buy into what Dr. Oby and Laila have shared about opportunities, etc. But I just think it's worth remembering. We had moments like this in the past. When the car was invented, there was huge fear that all of the people who drove horses, who rode horses and carriages and made those carriages would be out of jobs. And the truth is they were. But having said that, many, many more jobs were created by the advent of cars. Many, many, many more that we couldn't imagine at the time. The same thing happened with computers. When computers started to become more prevalent, people said, what's going to happen to all the number crunchers and people who work to calculate things? Yes, those jobs were lost, but in its place, tenfold were created in new areas of human exploration. And so I think the point around being nimble, being thoughtful, not being paralyzed by fear, building our skills is absolutely essential to explore the new vistas of human endeavor that will be created.
I agree with you all. I would just add to that, folks should really be thinking about me using AI as an individual compared to the individual not using AI. So I think to a large extent, that's what will differentiate people from each other. So look at it as a tool that can empower you. To Omid's point, definitely many jobs will disappear. Many more will be created, but the trend is moving towards higher value jobs. So the lower value jobs are the ones that are less likely to exist, meaning the ones that involve lower levels of complexity. So things that require, for instance, more strategic thinking or analytical skills, are the nature of jobs that we will need more of. Another huge area which is massively underestimated, and I encourage everyone on the call to consider, is culture. So cultural understanding remains a big gap that AI can't really bridge. So how you communicate to people depending on their culture and their backgrounds, how you deal with specific circumstances based on the reaction you're seeing. So everything around what used to be called soft skills, and now, at least at Nexford, we refer to as power skills. Things like communication, critical thinking, and strategic thinking are extremely important and aren't going to go anywhere, as a result of AI. I have to go back to government because we skipped that point, and I think it's critical to speak about, but maybe from a civic duty perspective. So I think everyone, there's lots of questions on the webinar today around, okay, what do we do in the wake of corruption, governments that don't listen to us and so forth. So maybe, I know this is an area that, close to Dr. Oby's heart in particular, so maybe we can start with that. In terms of, again, keeping it practical, what should people be thinking or taking away from this webinar in terms of their ability to bring change to countries that either don't have democratic systems or have broken systems? As an individual, if I feel disenfranchised today and I'm on the sideline thinking of leaving the continent, what would you say to these people?
Well, not everybody can leave because the countries that are welcoming young Africans into their societies at this time, they are actually also cleverly selecting the best to leave the continent. And, so if we know that not everybody can leave, then those of us that remain have to think of how they build the society that they would love to live in. And that means that there has to be a more collective effort on that demand side of governance. What governance is doing on the supply side at this time is not good enough. And that's why I constantly harp on that. I harp on that because, a number of studies have shown that poor governance is a major barrier. It's a huge barrier to the development of the continent. And if we're going to then resolve that, it requires, as you said, the civic duty. I, in fact, coined the phrase that the office of the citizen is the most important office in the land, in any democracy. The office of the citizen is the highest office in the land. It is through the office of the citizen that other offices in the democracy get their legitimacy. If you're not engaged, they would not call themselves to have been elected. And even if they rigged the election, they would also be rigging it from the perspective that X number of you voted for them. So it shows you how important your engagement, your civic duty, your civic engagement is. And so the pressure that your collective effort can put on the system of politics to actually reorganize itself in order to offer the best kinds of candidates that would go into public offices and lead in policy making and lead in building institutions that are important and lead in the kinds of the right choices of investment in public goods and services that you need to enhance productivity. All of these would happen when the demand side for governance puts a pressure on the suppliers of governance. And that's why for me, I had to do something. You said keeping it practical, and I know why you said that. It is that we actually are going beyond lamenting about the absence of quality leadership and then or the absence of sufficient demand pressure for good governance. We're going beyond that, moaning about it, to doing something about it. And so the School of Politics, Policy and Governance, which we established, and you can find it on sppg.org, sppg.org. That school is raising a new cadre of leaders, political and public leaders for the continent. In fact, the meeting that I finished before joining this was the meeting with the team that is establishing the SPPG in Senegal. So it's a continent-wide program. We're going to establish in many of the countries of the continent, and countries like Ghana, Cameroon, Mali, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Kenya are on the map of places where we're going to establish the SPPG. And that's going to give us the kind of quality leaders that will look at this report of McKinsey and immediately figure out how to connect the dots. The dots that have to be connected here are a lot. It clearly identifies what the challenges are, but you can see what the opportunities are. So the opportunities and the solutions, being able to grasp it at the level of public leadership is so critical for the development of the continent. And I end on the note that, look, for me, two main primary economic problems that the continent needs to solve: the productivity problem and the competitiveness problem. I wish that, we didn't need government in order to solve them, but we do need government to solve the productivity problem. We do need government to solve the competitiveness problem. I mean, if you look at it, even if it were that we should just tell government, okay, just get out of the way, that's also needing government, right? And so you're too much in the space, you're killing us, you're stultifying effort. So just go. That's also a role for government, the art of living, in order to create the space for the talent to find its way without any hurdles on its way. So clearly, we encourage many of you who are looking for things in the private sector to also be attentive to the kind of role that is necessary for all of us to play in the space of public governance. Thank you. I know you pointedly asked me this question, Fadl, because our students do take some of the courses at the school, right? At
Yes.
Nexford University, and often they report back that it is one of their very good, decisions to have included some topics at the Nexford University into their 140 courses that they do at the SPPG in order to graduate.
Yes.
I'd like to jump in, Fadl. This question is so important. So the first is because you were asking what practically can a young African do, especially one who's feeling a bit frustrated at present. So I'd offer a few things. So the first is to agree with Dr. Oby that as we were talking about what opportunities are there for young people, don't always think of just the private sector. Our government needs innovation. Government needs our best talent. It's so critical. So that's another area where you can prepare to go and serve. So that's one. And then the second one is really around this idea of emigration, right? So people are asking, what about leaving? And I try to think about this in a number of different ways. So the first is really that because of what we're talking about, the outsourced opportunity, now you actually can work. Usually you go to look for a job overseas. There's more and more opportunity now to work for an overseas employer. And in some institutions, I think at ADMI, the Africa Digital Media Institute, where I am, when it comes to game and animation, we did one survey and a third of the students in the class are already serving an overseas employer of some kind. So think about working overseas without necessarily leaving. We prefer this because we want you to bring those dollars back home. That's a real agenda for us. The other thing is to think about from a nuanced way, not always thinking that leaving means you have to leave the continent. You've seen that there's economies that are growing, there's other areas that you can move. So you can be an immigrant, but to another African country. That's another way to think about it. A lot of our ancestors did this and they're thriving. So also think about that. And then the last one is, I always say it's important not to shame people for leaving. And the important thing is that if you go, you remain engaged. A lot of studies are showing that at least in the US, Africans, it used to be in the 60s or 70s, you would leave and never look back or go finish a degree and come back. But the more modern way of doing it is more as straddling. So you either send remittances or you even come back and invest and you move back and forth. This is more the pattern of the future. And it's a way of adding value back home and coming back from a position of strength. And then the final thing I would say is around mindsets. I always say that there's never been a better time in world history to be young or to be female or to be African. Our ancestors would be mind-boggled to see the ease and affluence in which we live and how much things have improved over time. So it doesn't feel like it when you're living through it. But we actually did make quite some progress, up to COVID and going on, as you can see, to reducing poverty over time. Maybe not absolute numbers, but definitely as a percentage of the population. Most countries are achieving this. And, if you look at popular discourse, you're tempted to think the world is, falling apart and at the end. But as a young person, I think a very important thing is to get control of your mindset and get into a position where you're saying, what do I have in my hand? What is it I can do with what I have? And am I using my time well to upskill, to make a contribution to my economy or to my community, as opposed to letting yourself slide into despair, which doesn't help you and also doesn't help us. At a time when we've agreed we really need to be moving forward together.
Oh, 100%. And media, I mean, this doesn't sell media, but 100%. I mean, there has never been a better time to live, despite the world challenges that exist today. You know, people all across the world have never had access to as much tools, education, online, particularly as they do today, in order to be able to progress regardless of their physical location, their gender, their race, their ethnicity. Accessibility today is at an all-time high. So with that, I mean, we have 1 minute left. Any final remarks from Omid and Dr. Oby? Thank you so much for joining everybody else. We have 1 minute for final remarks.
Well, I think Laila said it so well. Our young people should embrace the future with a lot of I don't know how to put it. There's a level of optimism that is still available to you. The kind of opportunities that your parents did not have, you now have. And it's really a matter of how you're prioritizing your life. You have to set a vision for your life. You have to have a purpose. You have to basically trust that a journey that is anchored on knowledge, because knowledge is easily reachable now for you. To the extent that you actually joined us on this program, you already don't have the kind of disadvantage of knowledge asymmetry that used to exist in the past. So use that very well, and then build alliances, because you need plenty of partnerships. Small is no longer beautiful. So in your generation, small is no longer beautiful. You've got to collaborate. Collaboration is the key and pathway. Partnership unlocks so many resources that you would hitherto not have. And your partnership oyster is the world. So don't accept that nothing can happen, nothing can change. Something will change, and that person would have to start with you. That change would have to start with you sort of embracing the possibilities. I want you to have a possibility mindset. I want young people on the continent to see that the 21st century can be claimed by them. They can clearly claim to the 21st century. If you see what you all are doing in technology, what you're doing in the creative sector, what you're doing in a lot of the other sectors that are talent related, you would know that the opportunities are just waiting for you. But listen to me, Omid, I think, said it, and it's important for you to bear this in mind. You cannot look at the world from a tinted glass, okay? You can't. You have to embrace reality. And part of embracing reality is being curious enough to find what the challenges are. You must identify them. Be a critical thinker. I think it was Fadl that said that. The critical thinking skill, you need it. You need to be able to logically frame, ask the right questions. It was Einstein that said that if he had an hour to solve a problem, he would use 90% of that time asking the right questions. You must ask the right questions. Learn the habit of asking the right questions. Learn the habit of seeking the answers, and also finding what others have done in similar situations and adapting. I really wish you well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oby. Yeah, Omid?
Yeah, I was remembering earlier this week a sentiment I had when I was much younger. I remember thinking to myself, oh, I've just missed a trend. I think it was when people were buying real estate in my town where I grew up in Nakuru, outside of Nairobi, and people had bought in an area that had appreciated. And I thought, that's it. I've missed my opportunity in life to make money. I've missed it. I was too young. What I didn't realize is we are at a stage of great turbulence, great growth, great innovation, massive change in the whole world, not just in Africa. What that means is that every day there is going to be a new trend, a new opportunity that we would have not thought about 5 years earlier. So if that sentiment ever comes to you that, oh my gosh, I've just missed the trend or missed the opportunity, what you're forgetting is that tomorrow there will be 5 more that you hadn't thought about. And if you want to be the one taking advantage or creating them, you have to be at the front of your game, pushing the boundaries.
100%. And if anything, in Africa more than any other places, right? The number of opportunities that exist far outweigh anywhere else in the world. When you have, nothing or you have little, you need to build a lot more. So again, thank you all for our fantastic speakers today. We're really fortunate to have you with us. Thank you for everyone who's joined us. And we will be sending as much as possible from today's snippets, as well as the McKinsey report, to everyone by email after this call. Once again, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.